Hello, on behalf of the Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington University, thank you for joining this webinar. My name is Shay Hazkani. I'm an associate professor of Jewish Studies and History at the University of Maryland, College Park. Today we're going to talk about the Israeli settler movement, which has really become the most important political force in Israel, not just in the immediate political system with ministers such as Ben Gvir and Smotrich, but in the Israeli society at large. Even though they're only 15% of the Jewish population, they make up very high percentages of the Israeli armed forces, the Shin Bet, the civil administration, and increasingly also the judicial system, including the Supreme Court in Israel. Today, we look at the origin of the Israeli settler movement known as Gush Emunim, as well as its ideology and some of the more recent developments and their importance in the current reality, both with the decimation of Gaza and the Gaza war in the post-October 7 era, as well as wars in Lebanon and elsewhere. Now, I started every presentation about Israel-Palestine by showing this map and reminding those listening that the region of Israel-Palestine, this is a region of some 10,600 square miles, and there's a parity there between Jews and Arabs, about 7 million of each. Now, Israel and the international community likes to sort of slice up that territory to play with demographics, but we should really keep in mind that basic fact as we discuss the system of control in this area. And as many of you would know, the world's most important human rights organizations, as well as increasingly international tribunals such as the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, see the Israeli control in the area of the West Bank and some in the entirety of Israel-Palestine as a system of apartheid, right, defined by the 1973 convention as inhuman acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons over any other racial groups of persons and systematically oppressing them. Now, the apartheid definition was recently bolstered by the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, the UN's top court, that found the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the effective control over Gaza Strip as unlawful and called for this occupation to be ended immediately. Today, we'll focus on the settler movement in the West Bank, the strip of land west of the Jordan River, bordering on the so-called Green Line, which is the internationally recognized border of the State of Israel from 1949. And when I say internationally recognized, Israel itself does not recognize it as its permanent border, but most international institutions, including the UN, in most countries do. As I mentioned, the settler movement is the strongest, most organized political force in Israel today. Now, settlers themselves are about 5% or so of the population of Israel, but we really should consider this group in its sort of larger context of what is often called religious Zionists, which are the backbone of the settler movement. That group is about 15% of the Jewish population of Israel. As I mentioned, religious Zionists really control many key positions in the Israeli cabinet and are immensely successful in reshaping Israel, from the Supreme Court to the education system to the army and the intelligence services. I would say that many of the state apparatus today is subservient to ideologies initially introduced by the settler movement and religious Zionism. Now, today, about 500,000 settlers reside in the West Bank, alongside roughly 3 million Palestinians who live under Israeli military occupation. There are also 200,000 Jewish settlers in East Jerusalem and 20,000 in the Golan Heights, although traditionally, for ideological reasons, they're not usually associated with the settler movement. Now, even in the core of the West Bank, the settler movement is far from being homogeneous. About 40% or so of the settler community is believed to be secular, moving to the territories to search for affordable, cheap housing and quote unquote free land, mostly ignoring the baggage that comes with living in the occupied territories. That's especially true for immigrants from the former Soviet Union and Mizrahi Jews who formerly lived in development towns. For them, the moving into the West Bank in the 1980s allowed them to emerge as a new middle class in Israel. Now, it may come as a surprise to many, but most settlements are not what you may imagine, this impoverished shack on a deserted hill, but are very thriving in some ways metropolitan cities. Ma'ale Adumim, for example, with 37,000 people east of Jerusalem, serves a really important element in the prevention of any Palestinian state of entity from ever rising in that area. But it is a thriving urban metropolitan area with a country club and museum and very advanced education system, etc. About 7 minute drive from Jerusalem. And of course, Palestinians are excluded from these territories. Another famous major urban area is Ariel with some 20,000 people. 80 to 90% of them are secular, and over 50% are immigrants from the former Soviet Union. It's about half an hour from Tel Aviv. It has a university, industry, etc. Now, here I want to focus actually on religious settlers because that's the group that really pioneered the settler movement in its current incarnation. Let me start with a brief historical overview. As many of you may know, Zionism emerged in the late 19th century in Europe, and it was founded upon the conviction that Jews should be allowed to live as quote-unquote normal people under their own sovereignty. Early espousers of Zionism were non-observant Jews, and they were influenced by the Jewish Enlightenment movement known as the Hazkani, which is the intellectual movement from the late 18th century that was inspired by its European predecessors. And that weakened the traditional rabbinical leadership in Europe. Within this cultural revival, ideas like nationalism became popular among European Jews as they did among non-Jews. Now, when it became apparent that many European nation states were not genuinely willing to integrate their Jewish population on an equal basis, a minority of Jews turned to Zionism as a solution to European anti-Semitism. Some Zionists initially considered places outside Palestine to establish a Jewish sovereign state or entity, but that idea was abandoned by 1905 and Palestine emerged in the movement as the sole destination for Jewish migration. And this allowed a small group of Orthodox Jews to become active participants in Zionism and see immigration to Palestine as part of the Messianic process. And these would come to be known as religious Zionists. Against those comparatively few, the majority of observant Jews in Europe opposed Zionism as a form of false messianism. Why false? Because it went against the basic idea in Orthodox Judaism that the exile of Jews after the destruction of the Solomonic Temple was a punishment by God, and that only after a process of redemption, God will send a Messiah from the house of David that would gather the exiles in the land of Israel. So much of European Jewish orthodoxy saw Zionism as a deviant movement. They believed, of course, that the land of Israel and its biblical border was allocated to the sons of Israel, meaning the Jews, but they saw the creation of the state of Israel as a form of a blasphemy. But now we're going to focus on those religious Zionists because they grew from a very small percentage of the Jewish population, let's say around World War II, to a major force in modern Judaism today. And they actually regarded the establishment of the state of Israel, a modern national state, as what they called in Aramaic, Atchalta de Geula, the beginning of salvation, a part of a divine plan. It may be secular, it may be headed by leaders that are self-professed socialists, even atheists, and it may be confined and it's bordered, but nevertheless, they saw that a beginning of a redemptive process. And in that sense, the secular leaders of the newly formed state of Israel were playing out a divine plan without actually knowing it. Now, the colonization of Palestine was a gradual process, right? In 1882, Jews only comprised of about 4% or so of the Jewish population of Palestine, and certainly they were non-Zionists. By 1917, the year of the Balfour Declaration, Jews were about 9% of the population, 60,000 people, and the Arabs of the country were 640,000. And then in 1931, Jews are about 20% of the population, but again, Arabs are 80%, about 860,000. After the 1948 war, the Nakba, and the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, most of the Palestinian population were either expelled or fled from the country, and the population of the State of Israel in 1949 has about 20% Palestinians, only about 150,000, and the rest of the population Jewish. I'm going to fast forward now to 1967. As you may know, in 67, in the course of the so-called Six-Day War, Israel occupied the West Bank from Jordan, the Gaza Strip, and the Sinai from Egypt, and the Golan Heights from Syria. Now, research in the last few decades actually shows that the Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Levi Eshkol, was a major driving force behind the decision to establish settlements in the occupied territories, in the so-called places where Jews felt a bond. But at least publicly, he said that he did this while keeping all possibilities open for some future peace agreement. We actually have documents today showing that officials in his administration had said that any establishment of civilian settlements in the West Bank, in Gaza and elsewhere, will be a severe breach of international law, specifically of Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, that stipulated that it's illegal to transfer civilians from the metropole, from the mainland, to occupied territory. Now, for most religious Zionists, it was not immediately clear that settling the West Bank and colonizing that area and the Gaza Strip would become sort of a main idea of religious Zionism. Now, this ideology is often associated with Tzvi Yehuda Kook, who was a major figure in the religious Zionism post-1967. Now, Tzvi Yehuda Kook actually argued that most of his preaching relied on the writing of his father, Avraham Yitzchak Kook, who was the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Mandate Palestine. And there are some disputes as to whether Tzvi Yehuda Kook may have withheld or misinterpreted some of the writings of his father. But in any case, Tzvi Yehuda Kook became the spiritual leader of the settler movement. And most of his followers were connected with a very famous yeshiva in Jerusalem by the name of Merkaz Harav, or the Rabbi's Center. And put simply, Tzvi Yehuda Kook saw the entire land of Israel as sacred land promised by God to the ancient Hebrews or modern-day Jews. Therefore, Jews ought to settle in every part of the land of Israel that were available for settling. Now, it's really following 1967 that we see these attempts at establishing these Jewish settlements throughout the occupied West Bank that was now renamed Judea and Samaria to symbolize that the biblical Jews have returned. Now, it will be historically inaccurate to say that Jews were complete strangers to the West Bank in modern times. A relatively small community of Jews had lived in Hebron, where the Cave of the Patriarchs, or Ma'arat HaMachpelah, one of the most important religious sites for Jews, and of course for Muslim, is located. For Muslim, it's known as the Ibrahimi Mosque. For Jews, this is where the burial site is believed to be of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, there was a Jewish community that lived there continuously from the 16th century until 1929, where they were forced out following a massacre carried out by Palestinians of neighboring areas. Now, prior to 48, a Jewish settlement also existed near Bethlehem, where today the settlements of Gush Etzion are, and another one in the outskirts of the Gaza Strip, and in some neighborhoods of East Jerusalem. But by and large, these Jewish settlements were non-Zionist, meaning that the Jews that lived there were not necessarily supporters of the Zionist movement. Now, the first settlement attempt in the aftermath of the 67 war took place in Passover of 1968. A group headed by Rabbi Moshe Levinger rented out several rooms on the Park Hotel in Arab Hebron, and they famously sent a note to the Minister of Defense, Moshe Dayan, saying, "Happy Passover, the Hebron settlers." And that's where the term settlers catched on for this group. Now, they notified to him that they had no intention of leaving the hotel until a permanent Jewish settlement would be established there. And they were actually successful. The settlement of Kiryat Arba was actually established in an adjacent area to Hebron within a few years. To do that, lands owned by Palestinians were expropriated. Obviously, that will happen many times again, and a Jewish settlement was established. If you want to get a glimpse of who Moshe Levinger is, let me show you actually a campaign ad that he ran in the 1990s. That's already obviously decades after the settlement in Kiryat Arba, and then later on in the midst of the Palestinian city of Hebron was established.
אנחנו לא מפחדים להסתובב בחברון, מפני שהערבים יודעים שאנחנו לא מוותרים להם. מיד כשקורה אירוע ביטחוני אנחנו מגיבים כראוי, אנחנו לא מוותרים. יד תקיפה, ולפעמים גירוש עשרות, גירוש מאות, לא תיתכן הפקרות בבית שלנו בארץ ישראל. היום, האזרחים וגם חיילים, הנמצאים במצב של סכנת חיים, מפחדים לפתוח באש, מאימת הפרקליטות, מאימת המשפטים ומאימת המאסרים. כשאני אהיה בכנסת בעזרת השם, המצב ישתנה. העם בכל רחבי ארץ ישראל במסעות שנסענו בשבועות האחרונים, כולם אמרו לנו, אתם תשנו את המצב, לכם אנחנו מאמינים. קראו לי אישית, לוינגר, לך אנחנו מאמינים. הימין היא לא ימין, לפעמים הימין היא שמאל, לפעמים הימין היא חצי שמאל, לפעמים זה חצי ארץ ישראל, לפעמים זה פשרות. אם אתה תיתן את קולך למתלבטים, אם אתה תיתן את קולך למסופקים, להססנים, למפלגות האלה שבאמצע, קבל אמצע, קבל חולשה. תן את קולך לנאמנים, לאמינים, ללוחמים, תתקבל ארץ ישראל, תקבל ביטחון.
הכנסת הבאה תצטרך לקבל החלטות גורליות. כנסת עם הרב לוינגר תהיה כנסת שונה, רמה אחרת של מנהיגות. י"ז בגימטריה, טוב. יהיה טוב.
We'll get back to this theme of militarism, which is really, really important to this day. But let me take you back to the late 1960s. I mentioned earlier that labor Zionism and the quote-unquote left in Israel was instrumental in the colonization of the West Bank. But they had slightly different view. Yigal Allon was the labor minister from the United Kibbutz movement immediately after 1967, presented what he called the Allon Plan, which was his proposal for establishing settlement along the border with Jordan, the Jordan Valley. And he suggested a mix of civilian and military settlements in strategic location in those areas. And he also said that Israel will be extending Israeli citizenship to approximately 80,000 West Bank Palestinians. This alone plan was never officially adopted by the Israeli government, but much of these suggested settlements were actually established. They sort of espoused an instrumental approach under the idea that settlements should be avoided in densely populated Palestinian regions. On the other hand, the supporters of Rabbi Kook, right, the movement known as the settler movement or Gush Emunim, which is Hebrew for the block of the faithful, they actually advocated something very different, a very expansionist approach, with its central idea being settling at the heart of the West Bank, the Nablus area. And when this movement becomes influential in 1973, right after the Yom Kippur War, it actually presents its plan. And its plan is to create dozens and dozens of settlements that will surround Palestinian urban areas for the purpose of preventing any future Palestinian state or entity from ever emerging. And you can see it here in the map, and this is a very problematic map because it doesn't show the hundreds of Palestinian villages, only the main urban areas. But I'm showing it here just to show how the settlements surround each major Palestinian city. Nablus, Tulkarem, Jenin, Bethlehem, Ramallah, in order to sort of prevent an urban continuation or urban continuity between the different Palestinian urban areas. And this was already present in the blueprint of Gush Emunim presented in the 1970s, right? And so those 150 permanent settlements today, and there's also 150 what we call outposts, which we'll talk about in a little bit, are really established in such a manner in order to prevent, and that was stated publicly, to prevent any Palestinian state forever being established. Okay, so when Gush Emunim is established, the movement presents itself as this direct continuation of the Zionist ideal, which has been abandoned by Israeli leaders, and is sort of reconnecting with the genuine Jewish roots. And it set several goals upon its establishment. Obviously, settlement in all of the land of Israel, including what they call Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, the Golan Heights, the Jordan Valley, the Gaza Strip, and the Sinai. But it also advocates what they call an activist national defense policy that, quote, does not shy away from needed action based on moral reasons or politics. And they say that this policy needs to employ the Talmudic saying that if someone comes to kill you, rise up and kill them first. And we'll see how this idea of alternative morals becomes immensely important in the 90s and the 2000s. Now, about the Arab population, their view is more ambiguous, at least at first, but the idea is that only those Arabs who would declare loyalty to Israel and would give up political aspiration would be allowed to become citizens with few rights, and that those unwilling to do so for what they called nationalist reason should be encouraged to immigrate. Now, in 1975, the settlers make a major attempt to establish a settlements near Nablus in the location of the old train station known as Sebastia. They suffer some setbacks, but eventually the Labor government gives them support and allowed the establishment of settlements in that area. And by 1977, after the Likud right-wing party wins the election, the settlers really become an important power in Israeli politics. Let's fast forward to today, where we have 150 settlements in the West Bank. About a third of them were built on expropriated Palestinian land. about a third of them on land purchased from Palestinians, not always fully in a legal manner, and about a third of them on what Israel calls state land, meaning non-private land that was supposed to be used for the greater good was taken over by the state of Israel and later allocated for the establishment of settlements. Now, let me focus now on the settlers' view of Palestinians, right? Obviously, the indigenous population in the West Bank. The Palestinians are never referred to as Palestinians because that would give some credence to their national identity. They're always referred to simply as Arabs. And oftentimes in Gush Emunim or the settler movement discourse, they are depicted by the biblical term gerim, implying that they were strangers to the land, and that the only way that they may continue living there and receive protection was if they displayed loyalty. And if they resisted, they should be removed. This was really well captured in a documentary film called The Settlers by filmmaker Shimon Dotan, who shows a video of Yehuda Etzion, right, an early member of the settler movement who was later convicted in being part of the Jewish underground seeking to blow up the Haram al-Sharif, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Let's see here in a video from the early day of the settler movement talking about the choices, quote unquote, that the Arabs of the land of Israel will be given.
כאשר העם היהודי הגיע כעם לראשונה לאחר שהוא יצא ממצרים לארץ ישראל, יהושע שהיה אז המנהיג של עם ישראל נתקל באוכלוסייה גדולה מקומית, והדרך שהוא פתר אותה אני חושב שהיא הדרך המתאימה לנו היום. יהושע נתן להם 3 אפשרויות: מי שרוצה לעזוב יעזוב, מי שרוצה להילחם יילחם, ומי שרוצה להשלים ישלים.
קודם כל, מי שרוצה להשלים איתנו, בבקשה. אהלן, בסדר, ברוך הבא. רק מה, הוא צריך לוותר על אספירציות פוליטיות. הוא יהיה אורח בתוכנו, קוראים לזה גר תושב, קוראים לזה מונחים אחרים, לא חשוב. ואנחנו נתייחס אליו בהגינות מלאה, בכל מה שקשור לחיי הפרט, כלכלה, עבודה, בית, אבל לא הנהגה ולא ריבונות. אוקיי? אופציה ראשונה. אופציה שנייה, אומר מישהו, מה פתאום שאני אשלים? אני לא רוצה להשלים. אז אומרים לו, הדרך שלך פתוחה, אתה יכול לעזוב את המקום. הרוצה לעשות מלחמה, יעשה מלחמה. זאת אומרת, גם הוא אומר, אני לא מוכן להשלים איתך, וגם לא מה פתאום שאני אלך. ואני דרך אגב מכבד, ככה בסתר, אני אומר לך שאף אחד לא שומע, אני מכבד את השלישי יותר מאשר את הראשון והשני. זאת אומרת, כמו שאומרים, עומד על העקרונות שלו כמו גבר. אז אני מכבד את האויב, אבל לא אויב, צריך להילחם בו.
Now, I really like this short piece that was published by one of the rabbis affiliated with the settler movement early on in the most famous newspaper of the settlers at the time by the name of Nekuda. And he says, right, he talks about the Palestinians. It gives a very concise view of the settlers that I think many still espouse to today. And this is what he writes. We did not invite the Palestinians to come and reside in our land. They penetrated it and invaded it as foreign nomads when we were not home, only because of the compassion that lies deep in the soul of our people did we not evict them from here and allow them to live peacefully and quietly in homes they built on our historical land. For those who do not wish to live with us in peace, our verdict is this, that they be sent away to their people and their ancient land. Had they had any self-respect, they would have gone there by their own free will. Let's look specifically in Hebron. After the establishment of Kiryat Arba, Israel eventually in the 70s also authorized the establishment of a very small settlement, only a few hundreds of Jews, in the midst of the Palestinian city. And it's really the only city in the West Bank where Jews and Palestinians sort of live side by side. Over 200,000 Palestinians, and in the midst of them, several hundred Jews. The level of intensity and animosity there is really unimaginable. Now, this is a map of Hebron, and you can see the area here is the area of H2 is the area that is fully controlled by Israel and where the Jewish settlement exists. The area of H1 is formally under the control of the Palestinian Authority, although, of course, Israel raids that area and conducts all sorts of operations there on a nightly basis. Now, to give you a sense of how intense Hebron here, I want to show you a short video piece that I myself did when I was a reporter covering the West Bank and the settler movement for Israeli Channel 10. And I think it really captures a kind of reality in Hebron that made life unbearable for the Palestinians living there and gives you a sense of what we could be seeing elsewhere in the West Bank.
חברון אולי הייתה מחוץ לכותרות בתקופה האחרונה, אבל זה לא אומר שהמצב בעיר הזאת הפך אפילו טיפה פשוט יותר.
חייל!
האירוע הזה שתועד על ידי הפלסטינים מראה עד כמה הפכו החיים בעיר לבלתי נסבלים, במיוחד עבור משפחת אבו עיישה שגרה בכלוב, כהגנה מפני אלימות המתנחלים.
بديش اسكر الباب تدخليش انت ما تدخلي
تسجري
ما
الدلة
تدخلي
تسجري الدلة
ما تدخلي ما بديش اسكر الباب
לשבת פה בכלום.
יאללה, אופי הביתה.
شو دخلت
לשבת
ليش
פה.
انت ما
תסגרי את הדלת.
ما بدي ادخل البيت ليش انت
واو.
اتصلي بالشرطه
מצלמה.
شو جابك انت على هالصبح الله شو بتعمل لحالك
התושבים היהודים בחברות טוענים שמעט הפלסטינים שעדיין גרים באזור מסייעים למחבלים המבקשים לבצע פיגוע ביישוב היהודי. אבל הדברים הללו מחווירים כאשר רואים את התנהגות ילדי המתנחלים שזורקים אבנים על הפלסטינים. הנה שוב יפעת אלקובי מספרת לאיש בצלם מהן התוכניות האמיתיות של מתנחלי חברון.
יש שתי חלונות פונים לצד ההוא של העיר, רואים את כל העיר חברון, אז שכנה שלי קוראת לזה חלונות מוטיבציה. מסתכלים, פותחים בבוקר את החלון, רואים מה עוד יש לעשות. הבית הזה, בית של ערבים בינתיים, ויש פה עוד בית שהיה של ערבים והיום הוא יהודי.
ואכן כבר בשבוע שעבר חשפנו בחברון חומרי בנייה, בחשאי משתלטים שם המתנחלים על עוד ועוד חנויות של פלסטינים. התמונות הקשות יותר ממה שהן מעידות על התנהגות המתנחלים, מראות את אוזלת ידה של מערכת החוק. והחיילים רואים, שומעים, אבל לא עושים כמעט כלום, כך גם המשטרה. ביישוב היהודי אומרים שזהו בסך הכל סכסוך בין שכנים, לא יותר. הפלסטינים הם בכלל שהתחילו, לפני שנדלקה המצלמה, טוען דובר היישוב, זרקו הפלסטינים אבנים על היהודים וגם קיללו. תשפטו בעצמכם.
Let us now take a closer look at the 2005 Gaza pullout. Obviously, it is very difficult to be speaking about Gaza at all, given the current decimation of the Strip and the tens of thousands that have been killed there. First, let's establish what the pullout known as the disengagement plan was. It was announced in 2003 by then Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, who was previously a major supporter and sponsor of the settlement. Why exactly he did so is something that historians and commentators still argue. One of the most salient explanations is that he understood that in order to maintain the settlements in the West Bank, Israel would have to remove those in Gaza Strip. In any case, the disengagement itself took place in summer of 2005. About 9,400 settlers were removed from their homes in 21 settlements in Gaza. There were also 4 small settlements in the West Bank that were removed as well. The entire process took about 7 days, and let's watch another short clip from Dotan's excellent documentary, The Settlers, sort of depicting some of the resistance put out by the settler movement to the plan to remove the settlements.
האמנתי וקיוויתי שנוכל להאחז לעד בנצרים ובכפר דרום. אך המציאות המשתנה בארץ, באזור ובעולם, חייבה אותי להערכה אחרת ולשינוי עמדות. לא ניתן להחזיק בעזה לנצח.
נרשום את זה לפניך. בעזרת השם יתברך, הציבור בגוש קטיף לא יעקר ממקומו.
יהודייה כמו שהגויים עשו לנו כך עם הדגל המזופת הזה עם הדגל הזה
Now, when the plan was first announced in 2004, the settlers' leaders debated among themselves of how they should resist it. And some advocated this idea of trying to convince the vast majority of Israelis who supported the Gaza pullout to change their mind, while others called for deterrence, meaning sort of frightening the Israeli population by violently resisting the pullout from Gaza and threatening that carrying out this plan would dismantle the state from within, especially the armed forces, where they threatened there would be massive refusal to carry out orders. Now, it's interesting that the settler leaders at the time, their official organizing body was known as the Yesha Council, chose was that they would go and convince people in Tel Aviv and elsewhere that, quote-unquote, uprooting and expelling Jews would only bring tragedy. But what's more important for our discussion is that there were very important rabbinical figures that actually assured their communities that the Gaza pullout would not happen. And the rabbis used very strong religious rhetoric to stress this. Now, it's not that they said, we will not allow it to happen, etc. No, they actually invoked God. Basically, it says that there would be some sort of a divine intervention to stop the pullout. And this saying was most commonly attributed to Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu, who was one of the only rabbis who thought to have had these sort of mystical power and a sort of connection with the divine entity. And that means that tens of thousands of supporters of the settler movement believe that there will be some sort of a divine intervention that would stop the pullout from Gaza. When the removal of settlement actually took place, and it was relatively at ease with 40 out of tens of thousands of soldiers that refused to follow orders. But when all this was done, a different crisis emerged among the religious settler community. And people asked themselves, first, why were the rabbis and others promising that the disengagement would not happen? And number two, what can we do to prevent anything of that sort from ever taking place again? Now, on the margins, this was a crisis of faith. But in the mainstream of religious Zionism and the settler movement, the idea was that by creating deterrence of the Israeli society at large, that will be the way to prevent from something like that ever taking place again. The other strategy chosen is being better embedded in the government ruling structures of Israel. Not just the formal politics of the Knesset and the parties, but also within the IDF, within the Shin Bet, within the civil administration in charge of the West Bank occupation, and the judicial system. And since 2005, we've seen an unbelievable change within the participation of religious Zionists Again, only 15% of the Jewish population within the governing bodies in Israel. Now, we're looking at probably close to about 40% of all officers in the IDF that are from religious Zionism, and many in the top breath of brigadier general, meaning the chief of staff, are from those religious Zionists and often from the settler movement itself. Now, let's take a look now at some of the more radical streams within the settler movement, specifically those who are engaged currently in acts of terrorism, killing and intimidation of Palestinians in the West Bank. And we have seen in recent years many such instances, including the burning of Palestinian villages, houses, the killing of Palestinian families, the destruction of property literally every few weeks. And oftentimes, the group that is mentioned in the context of carrying out these attacks are the hilltop youth. They're not actually youth, as some of them are well over 18, but that's actually an interesting phenomenon that we really should focus on. Now, it starts over 25 years ago, but the disengagement for Gaza actually intensified this phenomenon considerably. Now, many of these hilltop youth live in outposts, those 150 outposts that I mentioned early on that were built starting in the 1990s, and many others are living in a new phenomenon known as grazing farms. 77 of these farm outposts were established in recent years. According to the Israeli NGO Kerem Navot, that keeps track of these grazing farms, this new form of outpost have been very, very successful of taking over a large swath of land from the West Bank, 60,000 acres, or a little less than 7% of the area of the West Bank known as Area C. Area C is about 60% of the West Bank, and that's the way that the territory of the West Bank was sliced up in the aftermath of the Oslo Accords of the 1990s, and that 60% has been defined as Area C, meaning, and that 61% or so, Area C is under direct and complete Israeli control, and that's where the Israeli settlements are. We won't go into that right now, but you can find excellent resources on the designation of the West Bank into areas A, B, and C. Now, many of those living in those outposts and grazing farms are trying to imitate life in biblical time, eating what they grow, simple clothing, no electricity sometimes, etc. And each of these grazing farms is protected by armed forces, and that's what actually allows taking over more territory, because Palestinians from the neighboring villages or towns are not allowed to go even near those settlements, those outposts, or these grazing farms. Now, there's no clear leadership for these hilltop residents, and many do not recognize the traditional religious leadership. However, at least two rabbis often stand out as a major source of influence. Let's first talk about Rabbi Yitzchak Ginsburg. He is a major rabbinical authority among hilltop residents. He is from the Hasidic movement, initially associated with the Lubavitcher Messianic movement, and his scholarly combines psychology and mythical Judaism. I want to focus on his preaching that relates to violence, which is often seen as giving a sign-off to violence carried out by hilltop residents. His most famous metaphor is called "It's time to crack the nut." He argues that the Jewish people are a nut that is inside the shell that is the state of Israel. For him, the nut initially needed the shell to grow, But now that it is full grown, it doesn't need the shell, meaning the state of Israel, anymore. The shell, in his thinking, delays actually the salvation of the Jewish people. Therefore, he preaches to crack that nut, meaning to replace the state of Israel in its current form with different judicial, educational, and government system, essentially a theocracy. The more dangerous aspect of his preaching is his support of Baruch Goldstein, a settler from Kiryat Arba, who in 1994 massacred 29 Palestinians in the cave of the Patriarch in Hebron. Rabbi Ginsburg contributed to a book in Goldstein commemoration, and he often talks about the importance of what he called the simple Jew, who through acts of revenge against Palestinians are able to hasten the salvation of the Jewish people and the coming of the Messiah. Israeli media often reports that the Israeli Shin Bet suspects that Rabbi Ginsburg from his Yeshivat Od Yosef Chai in the settlement of Yitzhar, supports attacks against Palestinian, attacks known as price tags, and violence against Palestinians more broadly. However, most of these allegations have not been proven, and although the rabbi was interrogated many times, he was not convicted with any recent terrorist attacks against Palestinians. Although he was put on trial in the early 2000s for racist calls and for preaching for the removal of Arabs from the land of Israel. Another major figure that is often mentioned in the context of the Hilltop residents and Jewish terrorism more broadly is Rabbi Meir Kahane, also an American Jew who immigrated to Israel in 1971 and established a political movement under the name of Kach. Kahane famously called to forcibly expel the Palestinians from the state of Israel and advocated the creation of a state according to halachic law. He won one seat in the Knesset in 1984 before he was banned from running again for espousing racism. Let's watch a short 60-minute interview with him that talks a little bit about his movement and its importance.
American-born Rabbi Meir Kahane, who is today the most controversial figure in Israel, lost his U.S. citizenship this past week because he holds office under a foreign government. He is a member of the Israeli Knesset, the parliament. Back in the 60s, this 53-year-old rabbi founded the JDL in the United States, a group that used tactics of violence and confrontation in defense of Jews. 13 years ago, he moved to Israel, where he now crusades to throw all Arabs out of that country. That stand propelled him into the Knesset, where his party currently holds one seat. But if an election were held today, some polls show, his party could win enough seats to make them a decisive force in the next Israeli government. His message is loud and clear.
The Arab is a cancer in our midst. And you don't coexist with a cancer. A cancer you either cut out and throw out, or you die. It's better to have a Jewish state that is hated by the whole world than an Auschwitz that's loved by it.
When he first entered politics in Israel, most people wrote him off as a kook, an obscene embarrassment. His violent tactics got him arrested more than 20 times. Now all that has changed. He has arrived. Kahane is especially strong among the Israeli young. Some 40% of high school students in a recent poll there said they supported his ideas. 11% said they would vote for him. And he has a great following among Jews like these in a Tel Aviv market.
These are Sephardic Jews. They come from Arab countries, and they know what Arabs are. And they never did want to live under Arabs. And that's why they're my people. Because I say what they think in their hearts.
If one Arab tell you, I like Jew, this is not true. And I tell you why. They grow up, and what they think, to kill Jew, to put a grenade, to shoot with RPG. Well, what they study, this is from Lebanon.
They always want to kill us.
If someone wants to kill you, kill him before he kill you.
They want the Arabs out of here. And until someone says it, they won't back him. I come and I say, Aravim achutza, Arabs out, that's what they want.
Arabs are the fellow human beings of Jews. Are they somehow not as good?
Not true at all. It's precisely because I respect the Arab and know that the Arab sincerely believes that we Jews are thieves, all of us. He sincerely believes that we are thieves. We came to the country in 1880. There was a majority of Arabs.
And you sincerely believe that they are thieves. They drain our money. They steal our land. They kill our children.
And therefore it's an immutable problem. It's an immutable problem. And therefore I want them out in any one of their 22 countries. May God bless them all. And just leave me my one country.
But you don't expect them to go.
Of course not. I expect to throw them out.
Israelis have always delighted in a good political ruckus. But nothing gets tempers flaring these days like the name Kahana.
Khan is going to be here. He's going to be like Khomeini. He's a very good man.
Kahana for prime minister?
Kahana is very good.
Much of Kahana's political message is based on simple arithmetic. If you include the occupied territories, 2 out of every 5 individuals now living in all the land ruled by Israel are Arabs. And since their birth rate is greater than that of the Jewish population, eventually, says Kahana, Arabs will outnumber Jews in Israel. And if the Arabs were to become a majority, then what would happen?
If you want to get some idea, look what they do to themselves in Beirut, and then you'll get some idea of what they'll do to us.
Slaughter.
Yes, slaughter.
The Israeli parliament has passed a bill obviously aimed at Kahana that would ban all racist parties. But Kahana asks his Jewish opponents how they would react to the possibility of an Arab majority in Israel.
In theory, do they have a right to be the majority? Yes or no? They can't answer that. They cannot answer that question.
If Israel is a democratic state, then obviously they do.
Right, but if it's a Zionist state, obviously they don't.
But you're the one who finds it impossible to accept both Zionism and democracy in the same state.
Anyone does, because Zionism, the very definition of it is the creation of a Jewish state. In fact, Israel is defined in its Declaration, independence, as the Jewish state. You think that makes Arabs feel happy? You think that Arabs rush into the streets on Independence Day in Israel to celebrate their defeat? I think that only liberals have such contempt for Arabs that they believe that you can buy an Arab's national pride by raising his living standards. Not by bread alone does an Arab live. Because I respect the Arab, I want to throw him out.
But a new outbreak of hostility between Arabs and Jews has given Kahana new strength. Scenes like this over the past few months. Individual Jews killed, others wounded, mainly by Arabs from the West Bank, acting with little apparent coordination. Pushed by public outrage, the government has taken tough new measures, curfews, arrests, even deportation of suspected terrorists, and the bulldozing of their homes.
We are slowly sliding into an Ulster situation, into a Belfast situation, slowly.
The cycle of violence only increases the bitterness of the new generation of young Arabs and Jews. The young Arabs, who have never known a time when the West Bank was not occupied by Israel, and who daily see armed Jewish settlers walking through the West Bank towns. And the young Jews, who after decades of war and in the middle of a fierce economic crisis, still have no real hope of peace.
I think people are frustrated. They're frustrated after so many years of trying a peace. There's no peace. There's continued war. There's continued terrorism, especially after the murders that were recently up north. People are aggravated. People don't know how to fight this.
People know that the only person that's a hardliner on all the issues and that's saying what they really believe is Kahana. He's the person that's coming out to the people.
Kahana turned up in the Arab West Bank city of Hebron, for example, a couple of days after a Jewish settler was knifed in the marketplace there.
Every tragedy gives us greater strength. And it's not going to be long before we have the power to clean this place out. And that's where I want them out, out, out.
Many Israeli soldiers make little secret of their support for Kahana, as do some of the settlers.
If I were the settlers, I would rampage through this town and put the fear of God into these Arabs.
Because they see that every 2 or 3 days, a man killed, and the killer is Arab.
Shocked by the growth of pro-Kahana sentiment and racism among the young, the Israeli government is starting courses in the schools and the army aimed at combating what has come to be known as Kahanism. But the problem is that young Israelis are still being armed and trained to defend against the Arabs. But Kahana not only wants to throw out the Arabs from the occupied territories, the West Bank, he also wants to deport those Arabs who are citizens of Israel proper. Last year, only the military prevented Kahana from delivering his message personally to the Arabs to the city of al-Fahm, the second largest Arab city in Israel proper. The rabbi showed a man what he thought of a piece of paper on which the man had labeled Kahana a racist. Kahana called the man a dirty Arab. Kahana often refers to Arabs as dogs.
I want to make it clear to those dogs that are standing there, there is no such thing as an Arab village in the state of Israel.
Many Israelis say that what set the stage for Kahana and the turmoil that swirls around him were the Begin years in Israel. Like Kahana, Begin and some of his associates made frequent disparaging attacks against the Arabs. Recently, some young Jewish members of the Labor Party tried to stop him from speaking at a rally in Tel Aviv. Kahana, true to form, went out of his way to provoke a confrontation.
When I take power and I ban these parties, I'll be able to show why I'm doing it. They're playing into my hands. These are people who won't give me to speak. They have written their own death warrant as political parties. They will not be allowed to speak.
Now, specifically about violence, Kahana believed that violence was a key in the redemptive process, whereas Cook, father and son, believed that the divine intervention that would bring the Messiah would not necessitate to act violently against the Arabs of Palestine, because they will come to realize that the Jews were the chosen people and that they were the key, really, for the Messianic process. Rabbi Cook talked a lot about Arabs being a ger toshav, right? This status that would allow them to continue living in the land if they accepted Jewish superiority. Whereas Kahana did not believe there could be any divine intervention of that kind, that the Jews would have to act on their own violently. They will receive God's help, but that they will have to physically expel the Arabs from the land of Israel. Now, it's very interesting that in today's cabinet, we actually have two individuals, Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, each of them hailing from a different sort of political lineage. One from the Kahana movement, right? Itamar Ben-Gvir was the spokesperson of the Kahana movement in Israel in the 2000s. That's after Rabbi Kahana himself was already killed. And Ben-Gvir is, of course, the Minister of National Security in Israel, in charge of the Israeli police today. On the other hand, we have Bezalel Smotrich, the Minister of Finance, also the one in charge of the civil administration, that is the government body that controls every aspect of the occupation in the West Bank, both in terms of the settlers and the Palestinians. Smotrich is often seen as a more sort of established figure, one that adheres to the Cookian sort of ideology, that of Rabbi Cook. And we actually know quite a bit about his ideology from a plan that he published in 2017, known as Israel's Decisive Plan. In it, he says very clearly that there can never be a Palestinian state, and rejecting entirely this idea of dividing the land of Israel. It's very interesting to see that his plan actually echoes the early platform of Gush Emunim, in fact, almost quotes it verbatim, as well as what you heard earlier from Yehuda Etzion. So these are the three alternatives that he says will be available to the Arabs of the land of Israel. The first category are those who are willing to forego any national aspirations. For them, he says, they will be allowed to live as individuals in the land of Israel in a form of a ger toshav, what we heard a lot mentioned earlier on. The second alternative, he says, those who choose not to let go of their national aspiration will receive aid to immigrate to one of many countries where Arab realized their national ambitions, or to any other destination in the world. So really echoing that idea that we can find early on in Gush Emunim platform. And of course, the third options is those who continue to resist Jewish hegemony and the state of Israel, and those, he calls them, of course, terrorists. He says they will be dealt by the security forces with a strong hand and under more manageable conditions for doing so. Now, we can see the ideology, both the Kukian ideology and the Kahanist ideology, really influencing policy making in Israel, right? Smotrich, for example, calling to wipe out Palestinian villages from which emerged armed resistance against Israeli settlers or civilians, and Ben Gvir sort of peddling a lot of the Kahanist ideas in one form or another. The combined party of Smotrich and Ben Gvir had received some 14 seats in the Knesset in the latest election, and according to prediction, it may achieve many more in the next election cycle. Now, it's important to note that the voter base of these parties has expanded beyond not just the settler movement, but religious Zionism to other segments in the Israeli society, which became enchanted with the kind of violent resolutions to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict offered by these two parties. Now, each of them is doing something somewhat differently. While Smotrich was given control over the West Bank administration and has fundamentally changed the way Israeli colonization in the West Bank looks like, the expropriation of land from Palestinians, the kind of resources allocated to settlements, Ben Gvir is focused more on making sure the police in the West Bank and the army and the armed forces align better with the settlers. Scholar Yagil Levy, for example, had suggested that in fact we've seen a major fusion between the Israeli army, the police, and the settlers in the West Bank, sort of forming one body that is seeking to enhance and increase Israeli colonization and push the Palestinian to those heavily confined areas that are often known as Bantustans, right? Echoing the way that the majority black areas in South Africa was set out. And that fusion between the settlers, the armed forces, the police, and the civil administration in the West Bank is what's shaping the new reality now, which may very well explode in another form of an armed intifada at any given moment. Thank you for joining us for this webinar. We'll include some suggestions for further reading about the settler movement and what is currently taking place in the West Bank on behalf of the Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington University. Thank you for joining us.